Maybe we can wait for another 2 to 3 minutes. Maybe we can wait for another 2 to 3 minutes. So now I guess we can start. Yeah, already we have around more than 5 minutes. So what we are going to do, we have where we have ended up in the last class. We'll start from there. Uh, can there be any mechanism how you can just take the attendance of the class? Then it can be convenient for me actually. You can make it somehow. Because today again I have lost my attendance sheet. Anyway, so in the last class we had a discussion on, I mean rather we are having, that whenever you want to go for the energy conservation, then the existing energy resources is also a very important issue. So based on this, actually, we are trying to find out that three main limited fossil fuel reserves. That means coal, oil, and gas. And see their relative advantage and disadvantages. From that viewpoint, actually, we have started with coal. And is it visible? And I'm audible also? Hello? Anybody just give a response?
Yes, sir.
Fine, fine. So then obviously we have found out that coal has certain characteristics, like it has got certain characteristics with respect to formation, and it has got certain characteristics with respect to the reserve and the consumption. So as you can find out that the R by P ratio, reserve by production ratio, is the most important aspect. And from there, we can find out that coal has a long, that means this is obviously reserve by production ratio is not a constant quantity or constant value. Some of your friends is trying to get in. But what happens actually, it depends on the reserve also goes on changing. That change of reserve is little bit less probable, but the production is can go on changing. In fact, depending on availability and the government policy, the production rate changes over time. So based on that, actually the R by P ratio is not a constant one. So whatever has been calculated has been made based on the current known reserve versus production ratio. So we find out that with respect to fossil fuels, the still largest reserve, rather the safest reserve with respect to time span, is the coal, because it has almost 100 years of assurance of being supplied, at least according to current R by P ratio. Now we are going into the next option. This we discussed in last class. So the next option is the oil. The characteristics difference between the coal and oil is, the oil reserve is not that widely distributed as it is in coal. And unfortunately, that's why the oil-rich countries, where some of the countries has got much more oil reserves, they have got a different, they have got a rather lot of earning just simply selling their oil or natural reserve. But many other countries like India is one of those unfortunate countries where unfortunately we don't have sufficient oil reserve, very little oil reserve than our consumption. So our entire economy is depending on the import, how much we import that particular oil. Anyway, so I'm coming to that part later on. Let's go one by one points. Most abundantly used primary energy resources in transport sector. So coal is mostly used in power sector, but oil is mostly used in the transport sector. But remember that some percentage or fraction of oil is also used in the transport sector, because initially when you fire the coal-based power plant, then the initial firing of coal requires the, some of the friends are still coming in. So initially, the initial firing of the boilers also is done by oil, and that's why shutdown and restarting of any power plant, coal-based power plant, consumes significant oil. So obviously, shutting down of any of the boiler-based power plants is not very desired from the energy consumption viewpoint. As far as possible, try not to shut down. Not to shut down means why it is required? It is required because whenever there is a power demand increasing and decreasing, accordingly, if you want to adjust your power generation, then obviously the steam production has to be also accordingly adjusted. If it is reduced, steam production has to be less. Then what is your option? Say you have 3 units. We call like that 2 into 200 megawatts or 3 into 200 megawatts. So obviously total 600 megawatts distributed into each 200 independent megawatts. So what you can do, you can shut down one of the units if say it is within 400 megawatts, but it is also not desired in a sense that in that case the firing of that particular plant again will cause a lot of extra oil consumption. Anyway, what I want to mention that though the oil is required for the power plant, mostly it is required for the transport sector. Then available in very few countries, production also varies widely. Okay, that's the most important issue, because the availability of oil being in very few countries has caused a lot of economic stress on many of the countries. It's simply natural reserve. No country has got any special achievement. They are given by God with a lot of oil reserve, and some of the countries are unfortunate not to have it. But interestingly, you can note currently what is happening due to this oil reserve variation and the transport sector being dependent on the oil. Interestingly, the current trend is most of the countries, due to compulsion and rather the two consecutive reasons. First is lack of oil available in the country, and second is for the environmental pollution mitigation. Most of the countries are trying to switch over to electric mobility. That means electric battery based vehicle has become the priority of most of the advanced countries, and India also has, because India has more compulsion not with respect to pollution but with respect to the oil scarcity. And there the interesting part, we always say that the India's economy depends on two most important things. One is the international market price of crude oil, and second is the monsoon rain. If the monsoon rain is not that strong and the oil price goes high, then Indian economy will undoubtedly have a big shock. Anyway, so availability in very few countries is a special feature of oil, and production also varies widely. Means many of the countries, for example, like US, they have a strategic plan that they produce less from their own reserve. US has significant oil reserve, but they still, though having that oil reserve, they import oil from other countries from the market, just because preserving their own reserve. When entire world will not have the oil, they will still have some oil to have their planning. Anyway, so that's the countries, if they can afford. Like other countries are compelled, they are not compelled, it is their strategic planning to preserve their own oil, which they can finally have when the other countries may not have. Anyway, so the production, but on the other hand, the OPEC countries are specifically known as OPEC just because they are oil production countries, they are known as, and they are united in a particular strong force with respect to the oil export countries. They can control many of the international important decisions with respect to reducing their oil production policy. So it's a political issue with respect to natural resources. And as I told at the very beginning, that energy conservation is a subject which is interrelated with so many interlinked issues. So the oil coal has not caused that particular much political significant scope at all because it is distributed in many countries. But oil has caused a lot of political issues, including wars. You know that some of the wars has caused due to the, this oil reserves. And in fact, people always go on saying if there is a war, there might be a possible reason that oil is the reason behind that particular, though any other reason is shown as the actual reason. And as you know, in the last war of Russia and Ukraine, there also the strategic planning of Russia is Europe. Many countries are depending on gas supply from Russia, and Russia has got certain restrictions on those because sometimes we use the natural resources as a political weapon. And from that viewpoint, actually, the oil has been several times used as a political weapon just because the oil distribution is not uniform all over the world. The third point is produced with high pressure and temperature from sea plants and animals buried under the silt and sand over a long period. The formation of coal and formation of oil, the original material is almost identical, biomass, but coal is mostly from the plant-based material and in the land area, not under the sea. But in oil, the production process involves, it is under the sea, and naturally under the sea there was not only the so-called plant-based material. Plant material is also there, plant biomass, but animal biomass is also converted into oil. So that's why the composition of coal and oil is also different, because the original input to these formations of two fossil fuels are also significantly different. So then we are coming to the recovered as crude oil. Then the refinery, then in refinery, different fuels are separated. LPG, petrol, diesel, etc. Most probably, the chemical engineers might be knowing that why these different names are given. The source of all these are from the same natural substance, that is the crude oil. The crude oil means what you extract from the oil mines or below the ground. So then this crude oil is basically a mixture of large number of hydrocarbons along with some other impurities. So what you have to do, this crude oil has to be, I mean, go through refinement in refinery. Refinery means what? Where the original crude oil is segregated or separated to different useful products, and these if different useful products are named as petrol, diesel, LPG, etc., etc., just because of out of their compositions means what are the ranges of mixture of hydrocarbons in those. For example, petrol has got certain ranges of hydrocarbons according to their molecular composition. Diesel has got a different hydrocarbon range. LPG has got different, that's why it is gas, etc., etc. But all of these segregated fuels are basically all are hydrocarbons. That means compositions of hydrogen and carbon. And from your knowledge of organic chemistry, you know the large number of hydrocarbons can possibly formed. They are not only the straight chain, they can be, I mean, different alternative options of forming the chains. So all these hydrocarbons ultimately contribute to the calorific value of that particular composition. So what is done, the import is done not on the basis of diesel or petrol or something like that. The import is done with respect to the crude oil, and then you have to, someone made a sound anyway. No. Yes. No. Okay. Then, but after that, the refinery has to be installed in the country of destination. That means India doesn't have the crude oil reserves because that's the natural reserve. But India has got several refineries all over the country. And most of the refineries, if you look into, you will find out at the seaside area. Many countries may not have that advantage because they are not always surrounded by sea, but India has got a lot of long coastal line. So this along the sea means generally the oil is transported or imported rather in ships, not in aeroplanes, because you know, as you can understand very easily, because these are large bulk transportation of, I mean, large chunk of weight. So based on these, actually, we, as the ship transportation is involved in the oil import, so refineries being at the ports is always advantageous because you don't need to make subsequent transportations from the ship to somewhere else, but you can get your crude oil being delivered at the coastal area, and if the refinery is there itself, then you can separate into the required products, and those required products are then goes into the supply chain. And this is a, as per definition, commercial energy. So obviously the supply chain is very well established. From the refinery, different separated fuels, if it is petrol, diesel, etc., and in addition to there are some other more which are in the liquid form. So they have got a different storage transportation system. I mean, the so-called the vehicles and the vessels all are properly designed so that they are ready for the long distance transportation. And at least those trucks which actually transport those things finally hand over those products to the local distribution center. For example, in West Bengal, I don't know whether you know, one of the very local distribution center known to us, there are several, is that Mori Gram. I mean, in the south section, Howrah Kharagpur railway line, there is one distribution center where actually this transported diesel and petrol are being deposited there. From there, the local pumps are also again distributed. So that is the supply chain we have to follow. So what is the process is, crude oil is imported, then it is in the refinery, means you are separating from the crude oil different range of hydrocarbons for commercial use or for which the technology is already developed. That's why refineries are very important. Every country must have a refinery to convert the crude oil to desired product or value added product of those supply. But these refineries has to be there in the country of destination. That means country who is importing that particular crude oil. Otherwise, if you make it separated at the country, it will not have a business model, number one, and those transportation of that particular I mean, pure diesel or pure oil, the price will also be much higher. So the people generally import crude oil and then they make through the refinery, produce their desired product of LPG, petrol, diesel, etc. And the refinery basic principle is, if you have a mixture of different liquids which boil at different temperatures, then we call it, the fractional distillation process. That means a fractional distillation, sorry. So where you can just simply heat it, so that the based on the different boiling point, those liquids will be separated in different chambers, if you can make that refinery entire system. And refinery is a very important area of the chemical engineers, and they are obviously it's rather mostly dominated by the chemical engineers, who have to design, who has to operate these things, associated with the entire system delivery by the mechanical engineers with their help. Anyway, so according to reserves, you can find out that how, not like coal, specifically the Middle East has got almost 50% of the entire oil reserve. So out of that, Saudi Arabia has the maximum with 15.8. That means a single country which doesn't have that much land area also, they have got the maximum oil reserves. A single country is 15.8%. That means almost 1/6 or more than 1/6, less than 1/5 amount of total oil reserves. And that's why everybody knows that this Middle East countries has got a lot of implications on the political scenario, international political scenario. So that's why, I mean, this unequal distribution has got a lot of problem. The Venezuela is another country. I don't know whether you are aware. There's a lot of, criticism of those Venezuela, the country Venezuela, who wanted to earn money and provide that money to the people directly as just gift to the people. Which is called doling of money. And that's why the Venezuela economy is now in a lot of problem. And that's why it is criticized that if anything is given in the form of not proper subsidy, but just doling out the money to the people, then you will face some problem. In fact, this Middle East countries will also face some problem in future. The people have predicted very strongly that when their oil reserves will be exhausted, they will have very little possible source of income, because the country, those people are not habituated to so-called education and their knowledge building, etc. That's why their economy is called resource-based economy rather than the knowledge-based economy. And resource-based economy is always very much vulnerable. If the resource is gone, their entire capacity or entire earning capacity and the overall social capacity is also not existing. But knowledge-based economy means you can add value to the product, industry will be there, you can export them. So making product out of your own technology is the value-added technology, which is the knowledge-based economy. Anyway, so but the other countries like Canada, Iran, etc., they have also got significant storage, oil storage. And India is from which country they will import oil, that will depend on many aspects. And one of the important issue is diplomatic relations with those countries. And you know that the India still imports maximum oil from Saudi Arabia, and that's why they are very sensitive with respect to even, some of the issues, if it goes very much political, that related to religion and other issue. So India has to be very cautiously move, because diplomatic relation is a very sensitive issue. If it goes beyond control, then your economy will get directly affected. And Iran is another country which is very sensitive with respect to Indian diplomatic mission, in a sense, because you know that the Iran has got a lot of restrictions or sanctions by the US. They have got their own disliking, the US and Iran, these two countries. And interestingly, India has got a good relation with US, and they also depend on Iran. And traditionally, Iran has got a good relation with India. And balancing these two, taking fossil fuels from Iran, because there may be certain advantages of there, rather than bringing it from Iran, rather than entire amount from Saudi Arabia. Because if you can, unless you can distribute your import also in different countries from the single country, means suddenly it is due to some reasons, if it is just completely off, your entire supply will also be off. So it's a very sensitive issue actually. This keeping the diplomatic mission with respect to oil import is a very sensitive issue. And this is related to our so-called energy conservation course, undoubtedly, because resource management of oil is very critical for India. But though till date India has maintained that thing successfully, and that's why the government of India has taken a plan. Though there is a lot of criticism over the introduction of e-mobility or e-vehicle, because some people or some group of people are which is called the lobby is always there. So they are trying to prove that this, I mean, switching over to electric vehicle will add more pollution. And it is not lie also, maybe, because maybe if the source of electricity of those e-mobility remains the coal-based electricity, then rather than this oil-based system, the carbon addition may be more. I'm not telling yes or no. There are research papers are coming up in this regard, or already some people are publishing, started publishing papers with respect to making some calculations. If it is converted 30%, 40%, 50%, what will be the scenario with respect to carbon emission? If the electricity is, because the load on the electricity generation will also increase if the transport sector is completely converted into, I mean, electricity or e-vehicle. Because in that case, the electricity percentage, if it is say one third of the total energy consumption comes from the goes to the transport sector, then obviously that additional one third will be added up to the electricity production sector. So obviously still it is coal based, then the CO2 emission is bound to increase. And on the other hand, little bit local pollution may decrease, though the global pollution may increase. Global pollution means CO2 addition, and local pollution means whatever whatever comes out from the so-called transport sector or the vehicles. And the vehicles always causes some local pollution, specifically during the winter period. A lot of pollutions happens, because that time the precipitations of those pollutants happens at the lower level of the atmosphere. Anyway, that so-called smoke formation, because already some water droplet condensation, and simultaneously those getting those water droplets as the nucleus, the other pollutants also deposit around that particular water droplet. So the smoke and the so-called fog, that the fog and the smoke together makes some sort of which is called smog, SMOG. Anyway, so based on these, the you know that the this sensitivity issue of the import of oil, as it has to be maintained very tricky issue. And then conversion to electric mobility is not a preferred options or desired options, or rather suddenly chosen option. It's some sort of compulsion for India. And moreover, you will find out that this is not about 50 years only. The entire global, as per the local reserve by production ratio, is going to be exhausted. So alternative has to be found out. So what is the alternative? That depends on the available technology and investment into the R&D to develop new technologies. So based on these, actually it's a decision, and any policy decision may not go for 100% perfect decision. Sometimes it is, I mean, a decision is taken wrong due to some casualness or carelessness, but sometimes it is taken with good intention and then reverse things happen. So policy making is not that easy. And that's why at the very energy conservation beginning, I always want to discuss some of these policy issues, which is rather not technology, but related to very interrelated issues. And then later on, I just go into the actual technology part to give the idea of what are the different possible options of, I mean, energy conservation. Then the next point is India has only 0.3% and has to import for maximum for its consumption. Already I have mentioned it, that 0.3% you can assume of the total oil consumed in India, and how much oil has to be imported from outside. And all this 0.97, or rather the 90, not 0.97, 99.7%, whatever is imported oil, that has to be go through the refinery to from the crude oil to produce the entire oil supply in the country. So India has several refineries. I don't remember the actual number. You can just find it out from internet searching. But those refineries actually taking the crude oil delivery at the coastal area, at the different ports, seaports of India, then these are converted into required products, and then there is a definite supply chain to distribute all over the country. The next point is reserve by production ratio. The oil will last for 50 years, that I've already again mentioned. That means out of the three fossil fuels, I have to check, the gas might have a little bit more, Coal has the longest 100 years, but about 50 years is also an estimation on the basis of reserve by production. If the consumption rate increases, then obviously it will be even less. So most threatening reserve of the fossil fuels is the oil, not the coal. And so obviously we have to plan in advance how we can keep our transport sector on, though there will be no oil supply, just not because of the political or supply deficiency, but the entire reserve will be consumed by that time as expected. But most of the countries will be depleted shortly. India by 17 years, as it is mentioned. So obviously, I mean, the planning has to be very war footing basis, and that has already started. E-mobility is a very much high priority in India now, and that's why that in Kolkata, at least many of us have seen that many of the buses has been converted into, I mean, battery driven bus, or other they call it e-bus, whatever you call it. So it has to be, there is no other option. At least they don't add to the local pollution, that is emission coming from the oil based vehicles, because these are apparently clean in a city, but though it is not contributing to the local pollution, but it is contributing to the global pollution in the form of CO2 emission, because that electricity is coming from the coal based power plant. But still it is better in a sense, because the local pollutions in city, what happens, the population density is more, and if the local pollution happens, the number of people affected locally is more, and those causes directly disease. The CO2 emissions as a global pollution has got severe international effect with respect to climate change, but the local pollution, the local people only get affected, and that affected will be in the form of disease. The climate changes will not cause you the disease will come indirectly from the even the climate change is considered to be causing disease really, because as the climate changes, then obviously bacterial viral effect will be different, and then those chains are being explored by the biologist, and there are indirect reasons of climate change of is increase of some of the disease. But no doubt, the direct cause of causing disease, especially the respiratory tract disease, is more by the local pollution coming out from the vehicles. Then we have got the so-called oil unit, that means the quantity unit. Generally, you find out that the oil is expressed with respect to barrel. One barrel means 160 liters. So as you know that if it's a large quantity, then obviously you have to define the corresponding units. As the oil is imported or exported, then it is not expressed with respect to liters, but with respect to, barrels, how many barrels, and each one barrel is 160 liters. Then some other source of oil other than the crude oil are the oil shale, oil sands, natural bitumen, and extra heavy oil. These are just not used for the direct transport sector, but they are also used in alternative applications. Some are used for synthetic resin productions. Some are used for boiler firing, because in boiler firing diesel is the best option, because diesel based systems it gets fired very easily. But obviously in some of the boiler firing, the heavy oils, what we call it, these are also used, because heavy oils, the name comes from according to the molecular compositions of the constituents of that particular oil, and they have got little bit difficulty in initial ignition process, but once they burn spontaneously, and you can add up the heat using those alternatives, because these are not suitable for the so-called available vehicle applications. So if you can find out some alternative applications, that's always desired. Anyway, any queries up to this? I guess no, because class has got very little response, I found. Anyway, so oil is over. Then we are going to the natural gas. In natural gas, the third one, that means the three most important fossil fuels. Coal we have discussed, we have seen the characteristics. Oil also we have discussed, seen the characteristics. And the critical issue of coal and oil is the distribution nature and the amount of reserve and the expected lasting of the fuel gas, of the fuel. Natural gas, the third most used primary energy resource. Obviously, with respect to quantity, the coal is maximum used, then availability is maximum, use is also maximum. And interestingly, this has been matched because with respect to technology development also is driven towards that direction. Because technology, you know that the oil-based power plant is also possible. You can generate the same power plant by firing oil only rather than coal. But they have been developed to coal-based technology just because that much oil is not available. So the initial firing is always done by oil. In fact, oil-based power plant would be much easier. In some of the places, oil-based power plants are there where the abundant oil is available, but they should not do that because that's a basically alternative form of reserve is not being used, which is more suitable. But this that's why the coal has got largest reserves and largest consumption also. But transportation technology, the vehicle, the IC engines, internal combustion engines, has been developed on the basis of two fuels mostly. Gas engines are also there, but mostly with respect to oil engines, and that has emerged to be economic. And that's why most of the oil supply has been rather reserved for or rather made for transport sector, and only small amount of oil is used for other applications areas. But the third most used primary energy resource is the natural gas, due to two reasons actually. Initial technology was not that conversant with natural gas, and in fact natural gas has got its more application thrust with identification of pollution of coal and simultaneously the oil scarcity. This is why, because you know that the natural gas has got more hydrogen percentage than the carbon percentage comparative to coal. Now think of the situation. Your fuel is a hydrocarbon component, and so its combustibles are both carbon and hydrogen. So if carbon burns, what is the product? Carbon dioxide. If hydrogen burns, what is the product? Water. Now, carbon dioxide is the culprit for the climate change, but water has no effect. It's a benign, unless it forms with by mixing with something, some acids, etc., etc. So, if any fossil fuel has got more hydrogen percentage composition in it, then obviously that will be less benign to the atmosphere because it will produce per unit calorific value less carbon dioxide. And natural gas is that particular fossil fuel because it has got more percentage of hydrogen, so obviously it's considered to be a cleaner fuel, not clean fuel but cleaner fuel. Cleaner means with respect to other fossil fuels, both oil and coal. Undoubtedly with respect to coal, the natural gas is more compared because natural gas use substantial use in the power sector now, and the switching over the coal-based power plant to the natural gas-based power plant is also the driving force was originated from the climate change problem, because the less CO2 addition for the same power can be done if you can convert one coal-based power plant to natural gas-based power plant. Anyway, so the available only in a few countries in natural gas, that's also similar problem as the oil-based as the oil fossil fuel oil has got the similar problems. The similar problems is there in the natural gas too. Produced with high pressure and temperature from sea plants. In fact, the root of, that means the genesis or origin of formations of these two fossil fuels, oil and gas, are very close to each other. Both are produced under the sea level. Both are produced with the biomass part from the sea. It can be animal, it can be plant part. But rather coal is more from the plant origin. Some animal part can also be there, but it is mostly from plant origin and produced under the ground at the land area, not in the sea area. So obviously composition of gas and oil is rather closer to each other rather than the coal. Coal has got more carbon content, but both oil and gas has got more hydrogen content. And comparison to comparing between the oil and gas, the gas has more hydrogen content. So obviously their origin or formation process are similar, but due to different period of storage, different types of biomass which was under pressure and temperature over how much duration, they are either converted to natural gas or is converted to oil. So these explanations are available in geology, and petrogeology is a very important aspect, scientific issue. They explore all this, the cause and how the formations, and their minimum unit is some millions of years, and they just go on calculating how one particular product has got formation history and how many years originally they were under sea or under land area, etc. So this is an important area of the geological people. But we know that the The gas is also produced from the sea-based biomass. Either it can be sea plants or it can be animals. Okay, buried under the silt and sand. The source is almost same in natural gas and oil. Mostly methane. The composition of natural gas is mostly methane with very small amount of ethane, propane, butane, etc. So you can understand that the artificially you can produce methane, but the natural gas composition is also methane. And in fact, the one of the way we are trying to use with respect to so-called, we can call it energy, I should not call it energy conservation, but energy security. You know that the coal levels resources are maybe at a particular depth much higher. So as the depth increases, then obviously extraction of those coals by using the so-called manual process of sending the labor below the ground becomes risky, because anytime there may be groundwater seepage, and those people will be trapped in a water flow. And that has happened several times in India also. The Chashnala accident has causes more than some 400 laborers, I mean, instantly died. So that's why what the people do actually, the coal-based methane is another option. Say this natural gas, if you don't have, you have coal at a larger depth from the produce, making some chemical reactions with the steam and the coal, you can produce the corresponding methane, and that methane pipeline comes out. So that if there is any subsequently leakage, etc., what will happen? The production of methane will be stopped. No human casualty will be there. Anyway, so that's why I'm just mentioning that most of the the hydrocarbon gas fuels is mostly methane based, and that's the simplest hydrocarbon gas, as you all know. And that's in any hydrocarbon fuel gas, the methane is expected to be in the largest percentage. The other gases like ethane, propane, butane, and some other etc. has to be there in the mixture in natural gas, and that's why the composition may not 100% matching with two different sources of natural gas, but general grossly the percentage doesn't vary much. Obviously, it depends on the formation process. It depends on how many years it was under the ground. It depends on out of which it is produced, etc., etc. Then, according to the reserves, the natural gas, the Iran has the highest lead. And you know the interesting part of natural gas politics is, or rather the so-called real fact, India has a long drawn plan of natural gas, how you can import. Oil you can import through the ships. Ships tanks will be filled up and it will be delivered, and then it go for the refinery, and then the products, liquid fuels will be distributed in the supply chain. But if you want to distribute the natural gas, then there are two options. Either you can make the bottled at a high pressure. Pressure means unless you make it a high pressure, you just cannot just store sufficient amount. In our domestic supply, the LPG is at a very high pressure. That's why you have to have 14.2. Most probably the amount is in each of the LPG cylinders. 14.2 kg of gas you cannot store at natural pressure temperature. And that case, obviously, the volume will be significantly high. So you have to store it at a very high pressure, and that gets converted into liquid at that high pressure. That's why it's called LPG, liquefied petroleum gas. Anyway, but what I just want to mention here in Iran, and Iran, though it has got maximum gas, India has a long drawn plan of switching over some of its coal based or oil based system to gas based system, importing gas from Iran. What has been exactly done in European Union, they have made their own pipeline of distribution from the Russia, and that is being paid back during this Russia Ukraine war also. And that's why the politics has got a lot of issues related to the energy issues, and energy is one of the big role it plays during the international politics. Now, the interestingly, Iran, though it has got significant maximum highest reserves, and it has got a country wise, they are willing to export that to India. But India has the largest problem because gas has to be transported not through any moving vehicle. It has to be transported economically feasible only if it is transported through pipelines. Now, what has happened with respect to the Russia and European Union is not happening with respect to India, because in Russia and European Union combination, there are the safe transport zone through which that particular natural gas can be transported.
and there is not that so-called terrorist area. But if gas has to be imported through pipelines in India, you have to initially make a heavy investment with respect to the pipeline installation between these two countries. And these several thousand kilometers pipeline installation is a significant investment of a country. But that investment is also viable or justifiable if the gas is assured. But greatest challenge of importing natural gas from Iran to India, though this has been discussed in many national level meetings, in some of the meetings I was also there, that it is very much challenging because that particular path through which you can bring Pakistan and Afghanistan, these two countries are there. So what is happening? It's not safe anytime, because you cannot enter for your security of your pipeline into another country. So anytime these will be exploded. I mean, maybe at a very vulnerable point, and these are just simply the pipeline is rather exploded just to create problem for the country. And that's why taking the energy policy planning, the politics is also a very big part. And still, the energy leaders in India feel that if we could have import gas from Iran, what the European Union could do from Russia, because they have got their common border, and in general the entire European Union is not that terrorist prone, so their pipeline supply is also not that vulnerable. Though India is the Gas Authority of India Limited at several times tried to make some alternative plans, making some path, but unfortunately this China, Pakistan and Afghanistan, we don't have very good political relations and not very stable political relations with these countries. And we have no other option than to carry our pipeline through these countries. And otherwise, the cost of pipelines will be very high, or that may not be very practically feasible to do those things. And that's why, though maybe economically we could have been in a better situation bringing natural gas from Iran, but we couldn't do that just because of the political reasons. So these things are all interrelated. Then from Russia, also the same problem, though they have got such significant natural gas reserves. And in Russia also we can have it very easily, but we cannot get it just because of the transportation problem, because Russia is not directly, I mean, there is no common border between Russia and India, and then they have to pass through the other countries, and they are not all very friendly to India. And that's why the natural gas has got that problem, though the Russia has maximum export to the European countries. Then Qatar, India has only 0.7%. With Qatar, actually, we have a plan for exporting gas also. And there also, if we can find out suitable path, there is negotiations going on with Qatar to import natural gas from that country. But India has, like oil, only 0.7%, and most of the natural gas is reserves in either in Bombay High, and or in the northeast part, some of the area of Assam, they have got the natural gas, but very limited, 0.7% only. So that's why it is not very significant. So natural gas based system development is not very feasible in India. Then it has also its life of the order of the similar lifespan of oil of the order of 50 years. So though natural gas is a cleaner fuel with respect to carbon emission, but with respect to reserve, it's not also very a safer fuel. Coal has got almost double the life according to the current R/Q ratio. But natural gas and oil, they are going to be exhausted in a similar, rather the closer time period. So these two fossil fuels, oil and natural gas, has to be replaced by alternative options. Then the currently contributes to mostly power. Natural gas-based systems are mostly into the, as I mentioned, the power plant, and it has got the most important advantage of being used in combined cycle power plant. I will have some discussions in my course also, because that's a very high efficient and highly efficient power plant means obviously the power, if the efficiency increases, therefore giving the same amount of fuel input, you can have more power, means you are having less carbon dioxide emission for per unit of power. So it's a, I mean, in indirect way, the high efficiency not only saves money but also saves the environmental reduces the environmental pollution. So obviously, natural gas-based power plant is always preferred if availability is there. But some is there in transport sector also, because gas-based transportation or gas-based internal combustion engines are also possible. And you know that in our Kolkata also it has started. I mean, the gas-based small vehicles are there. Auto, etc., are running with gas now, because otherwise those who are adding more pollutions. And as I mentioned, that they are comparatively cleaner fuel, not only carbon dioxide with respect to other pollutants for health hazards. I mean, that causes health hazards from natural gas. Those emissions are also less. And in Delhi, etc., and many of the capital cities, completely natural gas-based small transportation system like auto, etc., has been converted. In Kolkata too, Kolkata, that they are made with the color yellow and green. That means it is converted to gas-based transportation system. Previously, it was black and yellow, but now to identify those that they are converted to gas, they have been made into green and yellow combinations. And then building heating, it's not important in India because it's a tropical country. Rather, we are mostly depending on energy for building cooling. Cooling aspect is more important than heating part. But in some part of the building heating, still in the cold areas like hilltop, etc., we have certain applications of heating. But in Europe, lot of building heating is either done by natural gas, or there are alternative options of heat pump that I will discuss when I go to the energy conservation technology aspect. Then it produces less CO2 and other pollutants than coal and oil. So use increasing recently. So obviously, as I have mentioned that point, that the hydrogen content of natural gas is more. So obviously it produces less CO2 for the same heat output. And also the pollutants, the other types of pollutants emitted from the coal is also less. So that's why, I mean, the natural gas is considered to be a cleaner fuel. So next point is needs fuel processing before use and large capital investment for pipeline, that I have repeatedly mentioned. Availability also uncertain. Availability uncertain with respect to the pipeline installation, because if pipeline somehow is destroyed, then your entire supply line will stop. But if you make it ship, then you can pay the amount after the delivery, or the ship transportation is rather less uncertain or less vulnerable. But the pipeline transportation of gas is more vulnerable if those countries through which the pipeline is laid out are not friendly to you politically. Then it is liquefied to form liquefied natural gas LNG and compressed natural gas CNG for easy storage. Otherwise, as I mentioned, the volume will be very high, because gas means always that problem is there with respect to mass. The volume is so high that you have to handle. If you have to handle with a proper supply chain, or other suitable supply chain, you have no other option than to compress it. And compress it, it may be converted into liquid, maybe in the gas form itself, but still in the gas form, that in the highly compressed form. That's the CNG and LNG, two terms comes into from that viewpoint, whether it is liquefied or it is compressed form. So at the end, what is the objective of these comparing these three natural sources is entire energy conservation subject originally started from the viewpoint of fossil fuel crisis, mostly oil, because coal is distributed all over the world. And that's why, as a genesis, always, the subject study, you have to know that, especially the emerging subjects, the engineering or technological emerging subjects are always emerging just because of not from fundamental interest, but from the viewpoint of the application demand. So as the so-called oil crisis was there, then people started thinking we must have some energy conservation to depend on the other countries. And in fact, the energy conservation originated from the oil crisis all over the world in 1973. As I mentioned, the war between the Ramadan war between the Arabian country and the Israel. Now the question is, as it started, then initially, to understand the genesis of the problem, we have to understand the fossil fuel reserves, because this is the driving force for the energy conservation adoption all over the world. And out of those fossil fuels, there are three types: coal, oil, natural gas. And now you can understand, at least from these discussions of today and the earlier class, that these three fossil fuels also have different characteristics, both with respect to formation, storage, and storage means reserve, better to say, not storage, reserve, transportation process from one country to another country, and there are issues related to the political aspect of those supply chain. Based on this, undoubtedly, the coal has got a very important criteria of distribution over many countries. So coal didn't give much options for political issues, global political issues related to coal, because coal has many countries has got coal. They have got different quality of coal. You know that Indian quality of coal, though it is now it's fifth most probably according to reserve that I discussed in the earlier class, but it has got very high ash content. So Indian most of the not most, many of the power plants, especially the private power plants, they are importing coal from outside. That means from countries like Australia, Indonesia, South Africa. These coals quality are less ash. This is from the business viewpoint. But I remember that in last May, I was also one of the invited speaker in DVC conference, and there the energy transition, that means from fossil fuel based system to the renewable. They had a on DVC, you know, the thermal power plants are all coal based thermal power plants. So their conference, they when I made my presentation of in favor of distributed generation, what is that I will discuss later on. Then one of the very senior person of DVC, the chief engineer, he was actually asking, "Do you support this importing of coal?" My answer is very clear. Whether I support or not, that will not stop the system. Because the if the private companies found out that importing coal, they have an international market price, which is making profitable for better for them rather than investment with respect to ash handling system, automatically people will get the assured service, they will switch over for that. And nobody is going to restrict unless government has got a definite policy of restricting those import. And you know that the import and export has to be controlled properly by the government. But many of you might be knowing that whenever there is a crisis of food items in the country, government sometimes put restrictions on the export. For example, the wheat. Wheat export is a very common from India, because India has large wheat production, but that in addition to the internal consumption, we have substantial surplus wheat. So it's a good that is on foreign currency. But during Russia-Ukraine war, India imposed that particular wheat export embargo on the wheat export part, because there was huge crisis in the European Union for wheat. And due to that, actually, what happened, because Russia and Ukraine both has got significant wheat production, but during war, the war is actually it's stated like war someone wins but nobody loses. Rather, both loses, nobody wins. A type of situation, because in that case what happened, the European Union, the wheat supply is not being sent by these two countries either, because they are now agricultural production is a secondary issue, they are involved in war only. And that's why they have started importing from other countries, and one of the targeted country was from India. But interestingly, India, if they go on exporting, and India has got a lot of poor population, with respect to market demand, the export price that people can earn, then that will be much higher than selling it in the Indian market, the minimum support price, what is called MSP. So if the people can export wheat, especially during the crisis period, the price they will get during export business is like that. The market international price also goes on changing. Then obviously they will not be interested to sell it in the Indian market. And then what will happen? The wheat crisis, the food crisis will happen for the poor people of India. And just after the war has started, the India has made an embargo on the. As far as I know, that's not lifted still. That means now we cannot export wheat to the other countries. This is done, and this is why I'm mentioning these things is because with respect to the other this coal and etc. Also, the whether sometimes it is found that the Indian coal, the Coal India, etc., other companies has got a lot of loss, etc., then maybe sometimes it will be the embargo will be imposed subject to the approval of the so-called Supreme Court, because the business will also go for the court for their justice, and then if it is according to the justice it's possible, then obviously the import of the coal can be restricted, and that is the basically a on sort of on even playground for the public sector power generations and the private sector power generation, because the public sector power generation by rule, according to parliament rule, they are not always allowed for substantial coal import, just like Air India is forced for the government sponsored tickets. So that means you owe your national own reserve. And then what happens, some of the private companies may get advantage by importing the coal from the technology viewpoint. So there are some reservations for those, public sector companies. Anyway, so these are, I'm just telling like storytelling mode, just because you can have those data in your exercise book, but interestingly, unless you understand the interconnections of the different issues, later on the technology part where you start, it will be pure technology. But unless you discuss these policy issues, you may not be finding out this how versatile this particular subject of energy conservation is. These are any good energy policy, energy conservation policy measures is very much interlinked with so many aspects of so-called resource planning, so-called efficiency, and then we have to think about the politics is play a big role. Like the countries, surrounding countries, how they has a lot of impact on the energy conservation principles. Because if we could have import gas either from Russia or from Iran, our oil dependence and the economy getting affected due to the OPEC countries' restrictions on oil price, etc., would be much more reduced, because then your transport system would have been converted into gas-based system rather than oil-based system much earlier. But we couldn't get gas like oil so easily from the two friendly countries like Iran and Russia, and that's why our economy is more affected, because oil price is much higher and the gas price could have been lower. And European Union has got the advantage of getting gas from Russia, and that's why they have got their power plants also converted into gas-based power plants rather than the coal-based power plants, and they have earned that particular climate change benefits from by just converting to gas-based system. But India is restricted not because of technology but because of the political constraint according to the surrounding countries. Anyway, so connecting the three major fossil fuels, if we make a comparison, coal has the largest reserve but maximum carbon dioxide emission. Oil has got the lesser reserve, around 50 years. Coal has more than 100 years. Then the second point is oil is mostly in transport sector, but oil being distributed very unevenly to some of the countries, and that's why oil has got a lot of political impact, international political impact with respect to the reserves. I mean, the countries that have got the reserves, oil reserves, and those countries which are depending on them, and that creates the economic shock, and simultaneously the political issues are realigned on the basis of this oil. And it's basically mother nature's decision that some of the countries only will have oil, not others, like not like coal. And the root or origin of that oil or gas being distributed into only some few countries is depending on the origin or source, because under the land, plants being submerged and formed into coal, that has happened in different places. But maybe under the sea, why maybe, it's a proven proved fact that under the sea the formation of oil and gas, the formation process could not happen in many places. So you can expect that those places where from you are getting the gas and oil, several years ago they were under the sea. Then these have become land areas, and in the meantime they have got their natural gas and the oil reserves. But from the use viewpoint also, the coal, uh, being from the own country, its overall logistics is pretty simple. But oil, after bringing it to the country in the form of crude oil, you have to make it through the refinery for the actual form which will be finally used in the entire technological systems. Natural gas can be brought through only through the pipelines, because bringing natural gas filled into cylinders or something like that at high pressure is not a feasible option. So natural gas can be used through export only if you have common border, or you have got the friendly countries in between these two countries where it will be originated and where it will be finally consumed, so that the gas pipelines are safe. European Union is very much friendly, not only friendly, they have defined their common currency. So if say some natural gas is being used in Sweden, and if that pipeline passes through Germany and the say so-called Hungary, if I call it the East European countries, Hungary and Germany, I'm assuming just arbitrary two countries, there will be no harm Sweden knows ever, because they are connected to a common currency and they are all united politically. So that's why the natural gas supply depends on the surrounding countries, and politics has got a lot of influence both in oil and natural gas based systems rather than the coal. But the natural gas is more vulnerable because you have to have a pipeline through those countries. And the oil, another issue is the oil storage and supply is comparatively easier because it's liquid. But gas storage needs additional effort, because gas means obviously you have to store it in a high pressure, either in the liquid form or in the compressed natural gas form. But in comparison to the Environmental impact, natural gas is the best out of these fossil fuels because it has got both less CO2 emission and other pollutants emissions with respect to the other two fossil fuels. Coal is the worst one because coal has a lot of carbon dioxide emission per unit of heat or energy conversion, but the coal has got the local pollution effects also in the form of ash. Oil doesn't have any pollution with respect to ash deposit because oil doesn't have any ash. Neither natural gas nor oil has got any ash exhaust, but it has the oil has got more pollution effect with respect to different volatile hydrocarbons. We call it VH part, which mix in air and causes different respiratory steam engine has got discarded. Steam engine doesn't need any electricity but still delivers power. So it was discarded just because of the electricity driven systems are much more efficient. So entire effort has been given. The railway locomotives has been converted to electric. Initially, sometimes it was diesel based locomotives also. But currently, if not 100%, almost 100% is converted to electric locomotives in the railway sector. Just because the supply of electricity, assured supply of electricity is very clean and over a long distance. So obviously you have to add up only electric power generation capacity. But supplying the diesel based or the coal based system has already been discarded because that's a very polluting sort of applications was there. So entirely those steam engines has been discarded. They are only going. They are not available only in the railway museums, nowhere else. But as I've just mentioned that energy consumption economy, these two are interrelated. That's very common sense. And sometimes the energy and economic growth are closely connected. Everybody knows the per capita energy consumption of a country is an indicator of the standard of living of that country. This is an issue which is not that much straightforward because the last point is energy intensity. When I'll explain that will be much more clear. That's a very critical issue because it's not that always true, but it's an indicator because in our country, as many of the people, they are below poverty line. They have got just meager existence, and they just what they do, they don't have that capacity of having electricity during when the sun sets. So most of those poor people, the poor rural people, they simply sleep when there is no electricity just after having their night meal, and they have no other option because they don't have the capacity to light their homes. So that's why their energy consumption is also less. And so obviously this, if the country is advanced country, then all throughout the night the economic activities goes on in presence of proper artificial light. So obviously the energy consumption will be much more, and the daily life consumption of electricity in gadgets, because say a mixing machine, a refrigerator, an air conditioner, all these are indicator of your higher standard of living, but all this consumes electricity. So per capita means per head energy consumption is undoubtedly a very distinct indicator of how much is the standard of living of those people. But whether this is absolutely true or not, it's an indicator, but it's not the absolutely true. that will be clear when you come to the definition of energy intensity later on. But still in economics we consider, just see the per capita energy consumption as a grossly or loosely we can say that expected living standard will be also higher. Then the planned investment to meet the growing energy demand of a country is very significant. This is a very important term. Now you can understand the planned investment means what? You have in any energy planning, you have got two aspects. One is the current situation and with respect to future prospective planning. In the Power's Ministry of Power, which is actually responsible for electricity supply, they are under two-way constraint. One is the regular adding up capacity, because demand of electricity is never decreasing, it is always increasing with population and with respect to living standard improvement. Both contributes. I mean, if the population increases, obviously electricity demand will also increase. But similarly, if the standard of living increases, then initially people could not afford air conditioner. Now they are affording air conditioner. Middle class people also, almost everybody has got now air conditioner. At least one room for good night sleep, they have the air conditioner during the summer period. So obviously the electricity consumption will increase. So the energy consumption has got a direct interrelation with respect to the so-called standard of living. So now as the increase of demand of electricity will always be there, government have to have significant capacity addition with respect to future planned possible increase. Even during COVID period, when everybody, all of us was rather confined at home during lockdown, the capacity addition in India has happened for several gigawatts. Has to be, because unless the government make a capacity addition of power plants, then someday we will find out significant power cut, and many areas of India will go under dark. So this is something like emergency service of adding up capacity. But additional pressure on the country is currently with respect to its CO2 emission, because as you know that the India and China, these two countries are very fast growing economy. Now China has reached even at the level of the developed countries. India is not that recognized still as a developed country, because India has a lot of poor population and at least our living standard is not that level. But China has already achieved it and they are emerging as a superpower. But in Indian growth rate, that means percentage of increase of the GDP is very high. And from that case, the energy supply has to be very steadily increasing in India. So planned investment to meet the growing energy demand of a country is very significant, and this is very much important specifically for India, because India has got a very steady growth rate. Then in planning of investment, targeted economic growth, national resources, preferred industrial sectors and social priorities must be considered. This will be clear actually when you just go a little bit about the government policies and the future prospective plans. The electricity consumption, as I can explain you, that with respect to magnitude, that means quantum of electricity consumption doesn't much depend on the domestic sector, though a lot of population is there, but most of the electricity is consumed in the industry sector, manufacturing sector. And some of the industries are specifically known for very high energy guzzling industries. That means they consume a lot of electricity per unit of their product, like cement, petrochemicals, aluminium. So they need a lot of energy, both in the form of electricity and also in the form of fossil fuel consumption. So unless you have very stringent restrictions on with respect to their energy efficiency and energy conservation, these industries will consume more natural resources than required, and they are put into competition or compulsion of making their energy efficient process better. So that's how I will come when I go into the Bureau of Energy Efficiency discussions and how they are come under the so-called competitive process of improving their energy efficiency by themselves. Anyway, but government has to make the social priorities also where the electricity has to be there, because government has got consistent planning of power for all, to the poorest of the poor people. But there are some issues which can be criticized also, though it has been declared that government has reached and the power has 100% power has been supplied to many of the rural villages, but actual situation is not that, because there are certain definitions in government implementation. If any electricity pole is there in a village, then it is assumed that it is 100%. In fact, there is no other option also, because making that connections to individual homes should be the responsibility of individual consumers. Otherwise, government has to give that, the subsidy based, 100% subsidy based electricity supply, and 100% means there will be some pilferage. So it's a really problem. Policy making is a very difficult issue, because people all expect that if it is given, free of cost, then that's the most desired. But no government can give anything free of cost. They have to continuously fight with the earning and balance, and making the social welfare balanced with the revenue earning. Otherwise, that will not be a sustainable option. So that's why the definition in government data of 100% village electrification may not match with the actual situations of those villagers or village people. So it's an interesting contradiction, but still we have to carry with that. So from that viewpoint, actually the targeted, growth, or targeted consumers, what the government has got the priority, they have to decide who will be the priority consumers, and we have to provide them at a lower cost, etc., etc. And we will discuss that agricultural sector has got a lot of hiccups. Hiccups means, why I call it a hiccups, because the definitions of providing electricity to the agricultural sector was a long drawn political decision, because the lot of people of India are in the process of agriculture, but the vote percentage is much involved with the those people. But interestingly, that has caused a pushback effect. Means many of the rich farmers in Haryana, Punjab, etc., they have used free electricity for their much of business profit. And actually now government is tightening up their rope currently through different mechanisms. I'll come to those issues actually. Anyway, so electricity supply tariff in the agricultural sector has to be rationalized. Otherwise, the energy wastage will be there. A lot of energy wastage will always happen. So the coupled energy planning, previously economic growth and the coupled energy planning were done irrespective of environmental concern. And environment has added up to this difficulty even more, because previously whatever you have the economic growth projection, and you have the so-called energy planning, means how much extra capacity addition has to be there with respect to your expected economic growth. That has certain correlations, and you can plan for those capacity addition per year, and say over the 10 years we will add some 5-10 gigawatt capacity, or it should be 10 gigawatt or should be 100 gigawatt. That should be based on your expected economic growth also, because you have to get your electricity consumed in the industry also. And these consumption are futuristic plan, not mostly depend on the domestic supply, but depends on expected industrial growth, because industry consumes much higher of electricity than the domestic sector. So with more concern for the environment, what has happened actually, previously this interrelation between the capacity addition and the economic growth was the only two issues. But now the problem is associated with the international compulsion with respect to climate change. So entirely, that the international pressure is there on those countries who have mostly coal-based electricity, because these are contributing to the CO2 emission. So India is also under severe pressure. So now, not only the capacity addition with respect to this so-called economic growth planning, but also with respect to the so-called environmental pollution reduction, specifically the carbon dioxide emission, these have become a multi-dimensional problem. So obviously now the renewable percentage addition is also a mandatory requirement for India. So, both meeting the requirement of electricity capacity addition and simultaneously meeting of the lower carbon emission is a very important challenge for Indian energy sector now. Then the EEE, we call it energy, economy and environment interrelations. Previously it was energy economy, 2E, now it is 3E. So the energy, economy, environment interrelations are very connected initiatives we have to take. Now coming up with the last item, which is put in red, that if you have a energy conservation measures at the national level, how you can see, because in national level, one or two companies having good energy conservation is not an indicator. You have to have a national level indicator. how much is the overall improvement with respect to energy conservation. Now, interesting part is there some of the sectors at a national level planning, some of the companies or industries may not have good adoption of energy conservation. Some will have excessively good and latest technology available, they will adopt, good companies. So what will happen at the national level planning of energy conservation, those who are responsible, they have to identify a parameter based on which this overall national level energy conservation measures can be measured. And this measure is actually done with respect to energy intensity. What is the definition? Total energy consumption in the numerator divided by the GDP, gross domestic product. Now look into the definition itself. What is GDP? You must have some idea, because every year during the budget, the GDP terms becomes very important, and manipulating GDP at the country level also there is some political criticism, from the oppositions, etc. GDP is basically a term of the subject of economics and national planning, where the whatever is produced in a country, maybe in the form of agricultural product, maybe in the form of industrial product, maybe in the form of service product that earns money, just add up those entire money value of the total products, gross domestic. Domestic means what? Within the country, not the imported one. So gross domestic product means whatever has been earned from the product within the country is defined as gross domestic product, or GDP. Now, what is the indicator of, what is the meaning of GDP, or what does it indicate? Undoubtedly, it indicates the economic growth. For the same country, if GDP increases, that means somewhere you have got enhanced production. That may be industrial production, maybe agricultural production, maybe from the service sector money earned. It doesn't matter. But the overall GDP increase means it's a sign of economic growth. In fact, the single most important indicator for economic growth is the GDP. And that's why, the country to country are compared with how much economically powerful on the basis of their GDP only. Now see, the interesting definitions has been emerged. This is basically a very important and interesting and very meaningful definitions point, that energy intensity is defined as total energy consumption, means all over the country. Sorry, someone is trying to enter right at this moment. No, there's a sound. Anyway, so this defined as this total energy consumption divided by GDP means how much is the total energy consumption in the country. That's interrelated with respect to your energy conservation and energy efficiency measures. Now, in this ratio, for the same energy consumption or lesser energy consumption, if GDP increases, your energy intensity decreases. Means what? You are becoming more energy efficient, whatever may be the reason. That means maybe some of the industries which has got more energy consumption, that has closed, whatever may be the reason. But the gross indicator of the energy consumption criteria with respect to the economic growth is energy intensity. So this energy intensity, now look into the factor, how it contradicts then with respect to the so-called per capita energy consumption of a country is an indicator of the standard of living of the country. Now, if any country has got very efficient energy system, then for very high level of standard of living, they may consume less energy. So they may have a good GDP also. So their energy intensity is very small. So that's why, though the per capita energy consumption is less, still their standard of living may be very high. So the general comparison of per capita energy consumption by the people of a country is not necessarily is the single indicator for assessing the standard of living. So standard of living is depending on both on the total energy, the energy intensity, and the per capita energy consumption. For example, it's to some extent depend on the social approach, because in transport sector, those who have the experience of Europe is very much conscious with respect to the environment and the sustainable growth, sustainable development. So they have introduced a very good public transportation system. Anywhere in any country in Europe, public transportation system is so good. Many of the people I know personally from my collaborations, etc., and I've seen it physically being in Europe, that the people even having their own car, they opt for public transport. It is desired because they have got a very good, efficient public transport system. Then what is the effect? Effect is in transport sector, the overall energy consumption is much lower because mass transportation system in the public transport system always reduces much reduces the energy consumption in the transport sector. But the US, the transport sector is not developed that much. So if you can find out there are certain public buses, etc. But in the city within, the movement pattern is purely on your personal own car. You have to have. And not only in Arabian countries, that is absolutely true because public transport almost not existing. You have very cheap cars available, you have very cheap oil available. Always everybody is driving their own car. That's the standard practice in Arabian countries. But in US also, that could have been if they switched over to the public transport system like Europe, they could have. No lack of technology, no lack of fund, etc. But their intention is not there. This is a social evolution because European countries doesn't have less money, but some of the countries actually I know the Scandinavian countries, even the highest persons like different ministers, etc. They also use the public transport system because there are two reasons. They don't need any that additional safety security people because their social approach is everybody is safe and secure, and that's why they move without any security people at all. But the highest political leaders, both in India and country like US and other countries like rather the our Asian countries, South Asian countries, they are they are never allowed to move without the sufficient security. But what I'm going to put here is the energy intensity of a country depends on the social approach also. The social approach means social structure as it is expected and so on. For example, Japan has got the very good energy intensity, but and that means very low energy intensity. Good means low, but you can find out those data from internet also, how much is the value. But USA has got comparatively much higher energy intensity just because their social approach is such that they will not reduce the personal comfort. They define it for personal comfort to have moving by their own cars. And interestingly, the culture of Europe is if you are say 3 member or 5 member family, then everybody has got their own car. So what happens? For the same amount of kilometers of travel, the oil consumption is much higher in US per person. But in Europe, converted to mass transport, in our country, the mass transport is also simultaneously has increased very much just because of our poverty. People cannot afford their own car. But Europe could have afforded that particular own car, but still they have not done. Japan also, transport system is much more depending on the mass transportation system. So what I'm concluding for today's class, energy intensity is a very important definition from the viewpoint of the measurement of energy efficiency and energy conservation. If the energy intensity of a country decreases, that may not be the sole reason, but there is a distinct proof that it is improving its energy efficiency. And that's why always per capita lower energy consumption doesn't indicate its standard of living is lower. Because energy intensity being low in European countries and in Japan, the per capita energy consumption is also low, but not necessarily their comfort and their standard of living is low. Transportation by one place to another by public transport, comfortable public transport doesn't make at all any difference on the standard of living whether you have your own car or not. And then there are different issues of the happiness index and social and the overall sustainability index, etc., are coming into the picture. And those picture the not only technology involved but also the overall social systems and whether the people are happy or not, that also makes an important issue. Anyway, so I close today. Today, whatever we have discussed, the rest of the fossil fuels issue, and then we have discussed about some aspects of the so-called energy, economy, and environment connections. These are all important issues with respect to both your examinations and the overall perception of the policy planning. But later on, we will enter into the technology after the policy issues. But there are still some left policy issues. And in Indian context,
how this energy conservation measures are implemented with respect to a specific agency, I will discuss it with some of the classes in next future classes. Any other queries? Unfortunately, I have just misplaced your roll sheet. It doesn't matter. I mean, one day you'll be given 100% attendance. Then I will find it out by tomorrow. Actually, so many other things were there this week. I was busy with so many other outside commitments, and somehow I've lost it. But I will get it. I'll get it next week. But if you can make some mechanism, because some of the students are helping me, of everyday attendance, if you can send me, then I can just skip about that particular responsibility of roll calls and other things. Just see if you can make it somehow. Otherwise, I have to make a roll call at the end of the class every day. But I have to keep that document. I also think so. Okay. If no other query, then I have to stop. And then tomorrow the class is also 8 to 9:30. So, no response. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Good night, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.